Good morning. Welcome to Chapter 1 from Intro to Human Communication, my Comm 100 class at Eastern Arizona College. If you would like to check out the book for this is Communication in the Real World from the University of Minnesota Libraries. It is an OER, so it's an open educational resource. So if you go to this link, open.lib.umn.edu/communication, it'll bring you right here. You can go through, you can click on these, you can read through the book and follow along with us. Students, this will be posted in Canvas for you, but they also have other open textbooks that if you'd like to use just for your own information, you totally can. Some of them are really interesting. They have like an intro to psych, research methods, social problems, pretty much anything that you would be interested in, they would probably have at least something related to it. So let's go ahead and get started. So some things to think about before we really get into it to kind of get your brain working. So what is communication? Can you name 5 forms of communication? Why do we need it, and how can it be helpful? What are some of the components of communication? How do we use communication to meet our physical, instrumental, relational, identity, and spiritual needs? How is communication guided by culture and context? And how can we become competent communicators? So, if we look at the history and forms of communication, how have we gotten to where we are now? But first, let's define communication. So communication is just creating meaning by sending and receiving messages that can be verbal or nonverbal, that are influenced by a multitude of contexts. And then why is it important? Why do we care about communication? Why did we even invent this thing that you have to study? Like, why do we have to study how we can relate to people and how we can talk to people? Well, because we as humans need to have a way to cooperate. We need to have a way to share information. So if we come across another tribe, we can have a way to say, oh yeah, there's good hunting this way, or communicate with them so we can trade things that we may need that they have. Humans are also natural storytellers. So if you remember in school every day after you got home, maybe one of your parents, would always ask you, okay, so tell me what you did in school today. Because they wanted a story of what happened in your day and also probably to figure out if you had any homework that they needed to help you with. And because we are very, very social creatures, we don't really thrive in isolation. Obviously, you have people who are definitely more introverted than others, but if you put a human in total isolation with no other human contact, then it won't be very long before they are extremely upset about that fact. So some different forms of communication. There are 5 main ones that we are going to talk about. So you have intrapersonal, interpersonal, group, public, and mass communication. So intrapersonal communication is communication within one's self. So your internal dialogue, your reflexive thinking. So you can use interpersonal communication to calm yourself down, remind yourself of things, process your emotions, rehearse conversations. We tend to do this like on first dates and stuff. So we think, okay, well, how am I going to introduce myself? Okay, let me practice that. Oh, let me try to say that a different way in my head because that did not sound good. Okay, if they say this thing, then how are we going to respond? And try to create different situations and different, I guess, conversation routes that could take. Interpersonal is between people who mutually influence each other. You can use interpersonal communication to begin relationships. So, maybe you're sitting at a bus stop or on a plane, your neighbor next to you starts chatting to you. It may not be a very significant relationship, but you are beginning that relationship. You're maintaining it maybe through the bus ride or the plane ride, and then it's ending when the bus gets to the destination or the plane lands. We use interpersonal communication to maintain our relationships with our friends, to keep up with them, say, hey, how you been doing? How's life? What good movies have you watched? And we use it to end relationships as well. Our interpersonal communication is influenced by social expectations. So what do people expect us to do in these different situations are going to affect how we actually go about doing it. They are typically goal-orientated. Most of the time, we're not just chatting to chat. We have a goal in mind, whether it's like, hey, I want to get this person's phone number, or I want to order a coffee, or I want to do XYZ thing. There's a goal with that typically. And interpersonal communication helps us fulfill our instrumental and relational needs. And there's group communication as well. So if you have 3 or more people working toward a shared goal, you are in group communication. Group communication tends to be very intentional. Sometimes you are even put together for a specific purpose, for a goal, and it tends to be more formal than interpersonal communication. You have public communication, so one person sending information to an audience. So this might be like a live speech you attend. So it is intentional, formal, and goal-orientated. So more so than group, because typically this is an important message that someone is trying to get out. Public communication is typically face-to-face so that you can get that verbal and nonverbal feedback immediately from the people that are there. But it is related to mass communication. So mass communication is basically just public communication. It's just transmitted through television, radio, newspaper, or some other form of mediated communication that is not face-to-face without immediate feedback. So the process of communication, there's 3 traditional models that we look at. 2 of them are pretty out of date. So the first one is the transmission or linear model, but it doesn't really work for technology because it's just a person sending out a message and the receiver decoding it and being like, okay, great. We don't use that really at all anymore. Now the interaction model's a little bit better because you have some contexts in there. You have the channel that you're sending the message to. You have some feedback. You have your psychological and physical context. So how are people thinking? How they're feeling? And then you have the transaction model, which there is a slightly better graphic for this one, but this is the one the book uses. So if you go in the book, then you can kind of see what this looks like. But it's the communicators always sending and receiving messages with the noise, like this interaction model. But you have more context to look at, and you are together creating the meaning of what you are saying. So you have your physical and psychological context. So how are you feeling physically? How are you feeling mentally? There's also the physical context of how you look, how you are dressed. The relational context of what relationship do you have with this person? Are you strangers passing on a street? Are you parents? Are you friends? Is it your coworker? Is it your spouse? What? You have the cultural context of it. So which culture are you living in? What is culturally appropriate and acceptable for the time and the place where you are? And the social context, which kind of relates to that as well. So for integrative learning, how communication affects your lives. So how does communication affect your personal life? This is something you will have to personally answer. I cannot answer that for you because I'm not you. How does it affect your academic life? Well, to be effective in academics, you have to know how to communicate. You have to be able to send an email to your teachers. You have to be able to talk to your peers to be able to get help if you have a question. Professional life, you have to be able to talk to your coworkers and your bosses and be able to get the information needed, synthesize that information, analyze it, and then send it off to where it needs to go. And your civic life. So if you are a competent communicator, then you can better participate in your civic duties like voting, being involved in politics, knowing what's going on in your community. So these are our needs that have to be met through communication. So your physical needs. If you are hungry and you cannot communicate in some way, shape, or form, either verbally or through body language, sign language, what have you, then how are you supposed to get something to eat? Especially, if like you're young or whatever, babies will cry if they're hungry. If you're teaching your children sign language, they might sign for hungry or food. But these needs help us keep our bodies and minds functioning. Our instrumental needs are more of our daily needs. So these help achieve our more short-term and some long-term goals. So maybe getting information. So, hey, how do I get to this place on campus? Where is the blank? Can I please get, a tea? And you can also use these to influence others. Hey, can you help me with this thing? If you do, I will exchange you for this, or I'll help you later with your homework. Our relational needs communication also plays a role in, because it's creating social bonds and our relationships. And like I said, humans, we don't really do well in isolation. We like to have relationships with people. And to maintain those relationships, we have to communicate and let our friends know and our family know that we care about them and we want them around, because if we don't, then they probably won't be around. It helps us meet our identity needs, so our need to present ourselves in some way, shape, or form, to be thought of in particular ways. And then our spiritual needs as well, so it helps us meet our need to share beliefs and our values with others, whether this be through church or temple or your synagogue, or insert whatever thing here. But all in all, the principles of the process of communication are pretty simple. If we remember back to our models that we talked about, this is basically just a verbal explanation of what that was trying to show us. So our verbal or nonverbal message is sent out, whether that be intentionally or not. So they say, like, if you're on a date and your feet are pointed toward the person you're leaned in, you're interested in them. But, if your purse is on your lap, your feet are towards the door, you are not interested in them. That might be nonverbal messages that are not intentionally sent out, but that people still pick up on. So, and then the receiver processes it and then responds with a culturally appropriate or learned response for that particular context. So, if you're on a date with someone and you can tell they're really not interested in you, maybe the learned or appropriate response is saying, hey, it looks like you're pretty uncomfortable. Maybe let's just call this off. And if you want to meet up together again, then we can. If not, no hard feelings, no worries. And then the sender responds to feedback, aware of the rules and norms of the society. So the person might say, I am kind of uncomfortable, thank you for being understanding. It was nice to meet you, but I don't think this is going to go anywhere. Speaking of proper ways of doing things, communication ethics. Obviously, if you have a ethical foundation, an ethical base that says, we're not going to lie to people, we're not going to try to cheat people out of their money, then you're, pretty solid. Like the meme says, you don't have to worry about ethics if you do everything with integrity. If you do things with the intent to be good and do good for the greatest amount of people that you can, and try not to harm people, try not to, quote unquote, be a bad person. But with it, it's more just kind of guidelines. So what are you doing based on the situation and the information that you have available? But to be a competent communicator, what do you have to do? You have to know effective and appropriate communication patterns and tactics, and have the ability to use them and adapt that knowledge in varying contexts. It's all great and wonderful if you know these things, but actually putting it into practice is what makes you a competent communicator. So you get the knowledge through observation, evaluation, and instruction. So let's say you go to a foreign country and you're not quite sure how to greet people. What's the appropriate way? So you gain the knowledge through watching other people greet each other. Do they do it with a handshake? Do they do it with a bow? Do they do it with a kiss on one cheek, kiss on both cheeks? Do they have a cool secret handshake that they have to do? What? And then do you have the physical ability to do so? Do you have the psychological ability to do so? If everyone does this cool secret handshake that involves like linking up different fingers, and maybe you're missing 2 or 3 fingers on your hand from an accident, you might not have the physiological ability to participate in that particular form of greeting. And then the psychological ability, maybe you're just not in the mood for something. Maybe you have a lot of communication apprehension about going up and talking to someone. And then do you have the adaptability to do so? Can you adapt to different social contexts? Can you adapt to different cultural contexts? Can you understand power differences and adapt to those and say, okay, I'm in this particular place that has a very high power distance. So here in America, we have a very low power distance. We typically treat people relatively the same no matter what their standing is. But other countries don't do that. So can we pick up on that and say, okay, well, with my coworker, my peer, I can greet them this way, but with my boss's boss, I, can't just go in for a handshake and say, nice to meet you. I have to do something different. So the National Communication Association has defined what students, so what you guys, should be able to do in terms of speaking and listening competencies by the time you guys graduate from college, whether that be community college or a bachelor's degree. So you should be able to state your ideas clearly so that other people can understand you. You should be able to communicate ethically, so without deception, without lying, with good goals. So you have to be able to recognize when it's appropriate to communicate and when it's appropriate maybe to stay silent or communicate less. You have to be able to identify your own communication goals. So what is your goal in this particular situation? This is a good way to deal with trolls. So if you think someone might be trolling you, you could just say, okay, well, what is your goal? If they cannot specifically state a goal and you can say, okay, well, then let's work towards this by doing X, Y, Z, then they're probably a troll and just, ignore them. You have to be able to select the most appropriate and effective medium for communicating. So is the most effective and appropriate medium maybe face-to-face? Is it cell phone? Is it text? Is it Instagram DM, Facebook message, YouTube video? Insert whatever here. So you have to be able to decide which one is most effective for my communication goal. You have to be able to demonstrate credibility. This means being able to get research, support your ideas, have factual data and evidence to back up the claims that you are trying to make. Be able to identify and manage misunderstandings. So when a communication mishap happens, you have to say, okay, something went wrong. Let's see where it went wrong, and then now what can we do about it? Because, you'll probably offend someone somewhere at some point in your life, most likely through a misunderstanding. So how can we manage that? We can't take back the things that we've said or the things that we've done, but we can try to come to an understanding and say, yes, that is, word for word, that is what I said, but that is not what I meant. The meaning I was trying to convey was this. I apologize. I said it the wrong way. You have to be able to manage conflict. So when issues come up, in your personal life, your professional life, and your, in whatever, can you manage the conflict that arises from it? Or do you just fly off the handle and ruin all of your relationships whenever conflict arises? You should be able to be open-minded about another's point of view. Everyone in this world has information that you do not, and everyone in this world has an opinion that you do not share. So you should be able to be open-minded about those points of view and say, yeah, I may not agree with you. I might think you're wrong, but can you explain to me how you got to this point where you are at? How did you come to this? Why do you think this way? I want to learn the reasoning behind it, because if I'm wrong, I want to learn. And then, of course, if you've listened to any of my other lectures, probably the most important one, is be able to listen. So can you actually listen and focus on what people are saying? Because when you can listen, then you can be open-minded, you can communicate better. You know, it's part of being an ethical communicator is to be able to actually listen and try to understand what people are saying rather than just listening to respond, to refute what they're saying. So now that we have finished and explored chapter 1, you know, what is communication? Communication is the sending and receiving of messages. The 5 forms of communication: intrapersonal, interpersonal, group, public, and mass. Why do we need communication and how can it be helpful in our careers? You know, I need communication because that's what I do every day for work, and I love communication. I love talking to other people. I love learning from them. And then how can it be helpful in our careers? That will be a thing specific to you. Different components of communication. So your context, your noise, your senders, your receivers. So, and then how do you use communication to meet your needs? So your physical needs, your instrumental, your relational, your identity, and your spiritual needs. You know, how is communication guided by culture and context? Well, what's appropriate depends on the culture, depends on the context. Because you could tell the same story to 2 different people, but you'll probably tell it in a different way. Like, I'm not going to tell my grandmother the exact same story about, you know, a party I went to than I am going to my best friend. I'm going to tell my best friend probably a slightly more interesting story. And then how can we become competent communicators? So if we go back to that, we can say we can state our ideas clearly, we can be ethical, we can recognize when it's appropriate to communicate or to maybe not communicate as much. We can be able to, or we are able to identify our goals in each situation. We can select the most appropriate and effective medium. We can be credible. We can manage misunderstandings and conflict, and we are open-minded, and we are good listeners. So if you are one of my students, feel free to email me if you have any questions. If you are just watching this on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment down below with any questions, comments, or concerns that you may have. So thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.